Hi.
David?
Bill, good
Thank
to
you
meet
for
you.
being here. Nice to meet you. So I'm very excited to have this conversation because I've been reading your work and it's amazing. It's not just a record of groundbreaking work, but it's work where you were socially, in terms of what's happening with all of us, ahead of the curve on so many of these themes we're all talking about. So I'd love to go through sort of some of the topics you've hit on over the years and just dive a little deeper into them.
Happy to.
Great. So your 2009 paper on computational social science was actually the beginning of this whole field and conversation that machine behavior, which these conversations is about, is directly related to.
Yeah.
To a newcomer to the history of this idea, me, I'm just fascinated by how did this come to you? Like what was the germ of the idea where you decided to do that?
You know, there was a particular moment, actually, I remember at a conference. I've always been interested in studying social networks, but back when I was in grad school, if you talked about social networks, you're really just talking about people just interacting with each other. Mm-hmm. It wasn't about Facebook or Twitter or social media, of course. It was a long time ago. So in any case, I was at a conference, the social network conference, and there was one of the senior people in the field, this was when I was a junior faculty member, came up to me and said, I just talked to someone's doing this really cool stuff around, actually it may have been people related to Sandy Pentland, around tracking proximities of people during a conference.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sort of with badges or
That's
something.
Right.
Yeah.
Or somehow some devices.
Mm-hmm.
And that at that point, and I probably should have had the epiphany sooner, but at that point it really there was just like a moment where it's like, wow, that is so different than the standard social network research that had been done up to then, which was, you just ask someone a question, are you friends with this person? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. 1 if yes, 0 if no.
So it was interview, survey type thing.
It was usually survey, sometimes interviews, sometimes qualitative work, but usually it would be a survey where you asked about, here are 50 people, which of them do you know? And then you can look at the social network of those 50 people. Mm-hmm. That was actually roughly what my dissertation was on, was looking at a government agency of 40-something people over multiple points in time. And I realized, boy, if you could, track moment to moment, that's just a totally different animal in terms of thinking about social networks. And one thing led to another. I connected to various people, actually folks at MIT like Sandy Pentland, a student of Sandy's, Nathan Eagle. Mm-hmm. And we had a paper actually out in 2009 on looking at social networks and how surveys and how that related to proximity measures based on phones. Mm-hmm. And then I started to look around and said, it's everywhere, right? There's my email and the websites I visit and what I read, and the things that are not sort of these traces now will be traces soon. You could look at how people drive around based on their plates. You could look at what they're reading online. That everything that we were looking at was going to have like 3 extra dimensions to it, and that seemed to me that it was just going to completely change the game in terms of understanding human behavior.
And it did.
And it did, and it has, and it is.
So, and that was also the dawn of sort of big data.
That's right.
Everyone was talking about big data, and then
actually, it's before the dawn.
Almost though.
The dawn. I mean, of course, it was. There were big data before we had the phrase, and the phrase really came out of this McKinsey report,
right.
Which came a few years later. Mm-hmm. But I think the principle was the same, and people knew, boy, we got tons of life that's being captured digitally that is amenable to analysis and will tell us important things about human society. And then sort of the big data moment sort of came as as a sort of multidisciplinary, because big data is not just about humans, of course.
Right.
It's about the biggest data, maybe about astronomy. Say.
Yeah, or anything really.
Or anything,
Yeah.
but like there are a million things, ways that we're creating data that don't involve humans, but that there was something generally the datafication of all stuff.
Right.
And I think that's what the phrase big data in some sense was capturing.
So having gone through this early ramp up of the big data age and played a big role in that, you then were one of the first people to really take a critical look at the extent to which we shouldn't consider big data all by itself to be a panacea with your study about the Google flu. Can you speak about that?
Sure. The background there is that one of the first breakthrough papers in thinking about big data and social science was a paper in Nature called Google Flu Trends, which the idea was to nowcast the prevalence of the flu based on how much people searched about the flu. Mm-hmm. And so in this paper, they took some existing CDC data on the prevalence of the flu, around 1,000 weeks worth of data, and they tried to match it against Google searches. The classic paper in this area was a paper called Google Flu Trends. That was in Nature, I think, in 2008. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that your search behavior is related to your circumstances in life. And if you have the flu, for example, you might be searching for cures for the flu. Mm-hmm. And the paper demonstrated, the original paper demonstrated that if you tried to fit searches related to that were correlated with the CDC data on the flu, you could come up with remarkably accurate projections of the flu in a streaming, almost real-time fashion. Mm-hmm. As compared to quote-unquote old-fashioned ways where you would survey hospitals and then it would take a few weeks to tabulate. So there's this constant lag. Not only was there a lag, but also had limited temporal and spatial granularity. So if you wanted to know if flu was spiking in Boston this weekend, we didn't have the tools for that. Mm-hmm. And so there was like a really striking graph actually in the original paper, which showed here's the actual flu prevalence and here are our projections. Mm-hmm. And look, it's just almost identical. Mm. And I think that picture really sold a lot of people. But then almost instantly, so the paper was released, great fanfare, and I think that there was significant innovation in that notion of crystallizing that notion of nowcasting. But then it went off the rails almost right away because there was an off-season variant of the flu that occurred.
Sort of over-predicting.
Yeah, it was over. Well, it actually, our paper critiqued then the corrected version. Mm-hmm. So like literally almost a year after, it was, I'm blanking on the version of the flu, but it was, I'm blanking, maybe it'll come to me later. But it was coming off the regular season. And it was missing quite a lot. So they fixed it. They said, we fixed it. And it did okay. And then it started to over-project systematically more and more to the point where it was over-projecting by more than 100%. Mm.
Wow.
And this was for something that I was saying, well, we're off by 1% or 2%. Mm. So how do you go from 1% or 2% to 100+%?
So really wrong.
Yeah, really, really wrong. Exactly. Especially actually really wrong at the very peak of the season. Mm-hmm. When you most want to be right, it was most wrong. Mm. And so what we did was to walk through some of the implicit assumptions that there were in the original paper and say, it sort of had assumed that having lots of data sort of resolved lots of other problems with data. We call this sort of big data hubris, that you got the same old problems with data that you had before, and some new ones, and we actually have some known solutions. And so, and so like some of the old things we knew was, let's say, around overfitting. And so they just looked at, terms that matched the flu prevalence. And so they were taking something like 10 million search terms and fitting it to 1,000 data points. And those numbers are roughly right. I don't remember the exact numbers. Now, 10 million is a much bigger number than 1,000.
Yeah.
And not only that,
So
but
there's like a forcing they were doing.
that's right. Yeah, exactly. And they're finding things just like sunspots predicting the stock market. Sunspots really have nothing to do with the stock market. And if you think it does, then come talk to me. I have a bridge I'd like to sell you. But so they found things. So there's a natural cyclicality to the flu, right? It peaks in late winter, early spring, and it's low during the summer. And so they found in the original paper, buried in the supporting materials, they said, well, we found terms like high school basketball predicted flu. So we dropped those from the model. Now, of course, the reality is if you're finding things that don't make sense in your model, you should probably take a little more time to think about your model rather than just sort of drop them, right? And indeed, what essentially the errors were telling you was that they were finding a bunch of things that were predicting winter and not predicting the flu. And that there's some things just that were wintry that just by chance were peaking at roughly the right time in the winter at the particular few years worth of data that they were fitting to. So that was something that's an understood problem. There are actually statistical solutions to that that are based on standard applied statistics. They just didn't utilize those. There are other elements, though, that are distinctive to thinking about online data. So, for example, people change how they use these systems over time. Now, I can remember, and to people who watch this video, this will seem very odd. I can remember newspaper articles that talk about, you can use Google to find health-related information.
Yeah. I remember those too.
Yes, it's like, oh my gosh, I never would have thought of that. But literally, that was true. People wouldn't have thought of it back then. It's like you can actually find useful health information using Google.
Right.
So, of course, people were learning this over time, and they were learning, if I have flu issues, I could search for it, or I have a pain in the hip, or whatever. And not only that, but Google was building functionality so that they would do a better job of providing information regarding health and medicine and so on. There's a lot of money in those areas. There's a lot of money to be made advertising those.
Right.
And so it fit perfectly with their business model. But it didn't fit well with Google as an instrument for capturing how often flu was occurring.
For prediction, right.
Yes. Now, even then, they could have fixed it, right? They could have said, you know what, we have to constantly recalibrate our system. Again, they should have used a somewhat different way of doing the statistics in the first place, but they could have said, this relationship isn't constant. It's going to change. We're a living system. There are the people are changing their behavior, and the system is changing to cultivate certain kinds of behavior. And so again, there is this assumption of this rigidity of the system, both the social and the computational system, that was just not the case. And then there are other potential problems which probably were not so relevant to Google at the time, but we know that the socio-technical systems are under constant attack, efforts to manipulate. There have been efforts, for example, to manipulate autocomplete on Google, right? Autocomplete is supposed to be predictive of the next thing you're going to put in there. Well, there have been lots of efforts to play around with autocomplete so that there's something insulting about a politician, right? There was a famous case with Rick Santorum, for example.
Oh yes, I know that case. Yeah.
Which I won't go
We
into
won't get
now.
into the specifics.
But you can Google it. And so there was something very insulting about Rick Santorum, and that popped up with autocomplete. Now that was a manipulation of the system. It wasn't that actual people were started out curious about that. And of course, we can see that on social media. We can see that around politics nowadays. There's a lot of evidence of manipulation, say on Twitter or Facebook. Some of it Russian, some of it indigenous, some of it, people just goofing off. And so these systems are under constant attack, constant manipulation, and there are people trying to use Google and Twitter and so on to manipulate the information that regular citizens access. And so that probably was not a big deal with Google Flu Trends, but it is generally a big deal with computational social science and the use of data from those socio-technical systems because there's an incentive for ideological reasons, for monetary reasons and the like to manipulate.
Yeah. So one of the lessons, as I recall, of that study was that the new data, the new methods have a lot of power and potential to help us understand society, but it's best used when combined with some of the old knowledge and methods that we have. Is that right?
I think that's right. I think that rarely does something come along that completely displaces everything we knew before.
Right.
Sometimes, right? Sometimes, there are paradigm shifts and we say, the sun does not go around the Earth. But even then, we kept our telescopes, right? Mm-hmm. It was the new instrumentation that changed our paradigms for understanding the world. And I think that, indeed what we'll see is a fusion of methodologies that will end up being most powerful. Mm-hmm. I do think that computational social science will produce new paradigms for understanding human behavior. But I think it will often be in conjunction with, for example, the fact that we can track people's communications and so on doesn't change the notion of family and friends mm-hmm. and so on. And those are deep sociological constructs that potentially contextualize the digital traces that we leave behind.
Yeah.
And so we've done work, for example, where we try to look at how people behave with respect to particular relationships. So working on a paper now, for example, based on data that we collected after the Boston Marathon bombing, where we asked people to load an app on their phone and asked them and looked at who you called and said, or texted and said, who is this person? Why were you calling them? And so on. And so that day. Well, I mean, they loaded the app later. The beauty is that your phones are like are archives of your behavior. Yeah. So we're walking around with our own supercomputers that are tracking us, that mm-hmm. That are recording what we're doing, which is both creepy and problematic and powerful and wonderful. Mm-hmm. All of these things wrapped in
illuminating. Yeah.
Illuminating.
Yeah.
And the question part is illuminating to whom? Mm-hmm. In this particular study, we were asking, what's your relationship to this person and so on. So, like, for example, this would not be a science paper, but we found that the first person you called was your mom, and you would text your friend, but your mom, I guess she deserved to call, I mm-hmm. guess, and probably wasn't into texting. Mm-hmm. And so we have to think
your
about
mom with voice. Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Well, your mom has to hear your voice, and like I said, she's entitled to a call.
Yeah.
So there's a question of status and what's appropriate, and the technologies being used, mm-hmm. And so we're not losing that notion of what that mother-child relationship is, and that all the big data in the world doesn't change that. It does change how we should interpret those data.
There's an analogy to my old profession, journalism, which is, in trying to save its own life for the last 25 years, journalism really turned to data as sort of the thing that would save it. Data journalism, it was the only thing people wanted to hear for a long time. Data this, data that. And of course, it went so far that we went through an election where people were basically relying heavily on numbers and not on actually going to the small town and talking to people about what they were really thinking about the election. And they finally learned this lesson. It's the same lesson. Yeah. People down on the ground still have a lot to contribute because it's ultimately about them.
That's right. Well, it's the fact that I text you it's not about the data going from you to me. It's about our connection, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. which is ultimately correlated with probably things that are way more important than that text, like getting together, having a conversation, having a beer. Those are probably, all generally more important. But what we see in these digital traces are hints of that deeper thing.
Right.
But the potential dangers come when I think potentially when those digital traces displace other things. And that's it's an interesting question. To what extent is there a substitution effect versus all these complements that you send someone a text and say, hey, you want to get together? I'm on Facebook. I say, oh, I'm in Chicago, and someone says, oh, you're in Chicago for a conference? I'm in Chicago for a different conference. Want to get together for lunch, right? Well, that was pretty cool, right?
Yeah.
That's happened multiple times.
Right.
And so many of these tools are tools for things that we've always done, which is to connect with each other in various kinds of ways.
Doing it in new ways, yeah.
That's right.
So then your next prescient paper, if I'm getting the order right, was The Rise of the Social Algorithm, just before the 2016 election, talking about curated content on Facebook and the idea that maybe there's something to be concerned about here, maybe not. Talk to me about that. Sort of what motivated that? Because you really were looking ahead to something that happened in a much bigger way than anyone expected.
Well, that was actually, interestingly, a commentary on a paper from Facebook researchers that were looking at the different kinds of ways that the news that you see is curated, which is in part computationally because Facebook prioritizes some content over others, but there's a lot of human agency in there. You choose who to be friends with on Facebook, and you choose to click on certain kinds of content. And in that is a fabulous metaphor for the 21st century, that there is a sort of combination of computer and human, and the question is, what are the emergent consequences of that interplay? Noting that it's not just about you and the computer, but it's about you relating to other people who are in turn relating to the computer. And so in the case of Facebook, for example, there's what you see is in part a function of what your friends click on. Right, and then Facebook has said, "Oh, your friends like this, so we think you're going to like it too." It's a function of what you've clicked on in the past. It's in part a function of what's hot in the moment, and the algorithmic system is learning all these things from us collectively, and it's constantly evolving. It's just like, again, Google is a simpler metaphor for this, for the Google Flu Trends paper, where Google was changing, people's behavior around Google was changing. Google was the business model was constantly being refined to squeeze out just a few more searches, a few more clicks, and the question that I was posing in that is like, what are the long-term emergent consequences for that for society, for individuals? I didn't have the answer. I don't think collectively we have the answer yet. In some sense, it will always be a work in progress. But even this notion of the paper that came out, which was from the Facebook researchers, which was an excellent paper, but it was just a snapshot in time, right? And not only that, but it was knowledge being produced by Facebook about Facebook. And part of the question then is, if they had come up with something like, political polarization is Facebook's fault.
Or if they'd mentioned Cambridge Analytica.
Or if they had mentioned Cambridge, well, yes, that's right. So, to what extent are these, again, it gets back to the fact that, to what extent do platforms accidentally lead us to places as a society we do not want to be, whether it's around what we see, what we don't see, is to what extent should reality, for example, I'll put quotes around reality, be a criterion for what we see? Not clear it should be, right? Because, the reality is if I have the wrong understanding of what's happening on the opposite side of the world, it's not really going to change how I get home tonight.
Right.
Now, screw up Google Maps. Now that's a problem.
Reality's squishy and it depends on where you are.
That's right. And so, but there may be bigger consequences if we fundamentally misunderstand reality. That's not about my individual situation, but it's about society and the world. That we may end up with like some polarized politics. We have wrong decisions being made on the wrong information. That there may be decisions that, let's say, we make around politics and policy, which have zero, on the margins, zero impact on us as individuals, but have massive impact on us collectively.
Right, in the big
picture. In
the
big picture. And so, like, if Google Maps starts messing up in a big way, well, I'll figure that out. If Facebook starts serving up lots of misinformation, there isn't the same kind of self-corrective mechanism. And so we end up becoming collectively quite reliant on this. And we then don't have how then do we inspect the logics of Facebook, Google, Twitter, and so on? And so, that's something that I've, we've, with collaborators at Northeastern like Krista Wilson and Alan Mislov and Ron Robertson, have also been trying to better understand the algorithmic undergirdings of modern society.
Speaking of that, you had a line, I think it was in the Facebook, looking at the Facebook paper, about how should we be troubled by algorithms regulating humans? Yes, but let's not forget that humans have always been regulated by basically human organizations, have always had their own algorithms. It reminds me of that line from Norbert Wiener from long ago, that human organizations have always been machines of flesh and blood.
Yes.
And so this is sort of a reboot of that.
Yes. No, I think it's interesting. If you look at the, like, I remember when I was in college, wild crazy days, I was into cognitive science, artificial intelligence, and even though I was an econ major, the first paper by Herb Simon, who was a famous Nobel-winning economist, was Newell and Simon, which is his work on artificial intelligence. But at the same time, Simon was one of the foundational scholars before his AI work on the science of organizations. Right. Simon and March.
He's the perfect bridge between the two.
Yes, a remarkable figure, but also captures some of the intellectual unity amongst these concepts that we should think of organizations. We can think of around the human mind through a computational metaphor, but we can also think of human organizations through a computational metaphor. And that when we think about the news and about the world that we saw before Facebook and even now, it is still largely organizationally curated, right? The New York Times is not all the news that's fit to print.
Right.
That would be way too much to print.
Right.
And so the New York Times is printing what they decided was what their readers wanted to see, what they thought was most important. And we could probably point to a lot of problems in that curation system over the last century in terms of, let's say, issues around human society or race or inequality or so on, that they said, well, you know what, our readers aren't going to be especially interested in that. And so ultimately the problem is that we cannot possibly, even if you could provide all the news that was fit to print, we could not as humans ingest all of that.
People make choices.
People make choices, and then the question is, who makes the choice? Do you want a compendium of news where there's the front page down to the last page? That's one logic, and that was the logic of news media for the 20th century, most of the 20th century. There was the front page, there were the lead stories on the national news and so on. Now, how we access news is much more decentralized in its curation. So in certain kinds of ways, it's both more centralized and more decentralized. It's centralized in the sense that it used to be, at least we had the New York Times, and the Chicago Tribune, and the LA Times. And of course, we have a lot of these newspapers, but a lot of them have died.
Yeah.
And then all of that is getting sucked into a few infrastructures, into your Googles and your Facebooks and your Twitters. But then it's in part being curated by, if it's something like Facebook or Twitter, the people that you have decided are doing a worthy job of curation, of highlighting interesting stuff. But then there's another layer of curation, which is what Facebook or Twitter are saying, here are the things that we think you'd find most interesting.
Which they were reluctant to do, but then they're sort of forced to do it, and then it has its own problems.
That's right. And I think their experience suggests that, that we prefer, quote unquote, prefer curation, prefer being measured by, we'll stay on their site longer. But that, a lot of the stuff that our friends post is actually pretty boring. And that Facebook or Twitter can do a better job of predicting what we'll find engaging than just random chance. That is looking at the temporal, what was posted most recently, like let's say reverse chronological.
Right.
And that may well serve us in good ways, right? In the sense that we may be bored by a lot of the stuff that people post, and we may say, oh, wow, Google figured out the thing that I most would have wanted to see. Or not Google, but Facebook. And with Google, it's a whole different set of issues. But, again, the algorithmic curation there, it comes to the fore. But then, again, there it's much more, where it might point to might be more decentralized. So if you search for a story, it's not always going to be the New York Times. So it used to be just read the New York Times or the Boston Globe or whatever, a local newspaper, watch the local news. But they're just a handful of things. Now, I'm sure people get exposed, even as the number of news sources has shrunk considerably. The average individual almost surely gets exposed to way more sources of news. And so there's this weird logic of concentration and heterogeneity that is occurring, and it's all algorithmically mediated.
Yeah, so it's interesting, what you're pointing out here, because there is this nostalgia for the 20th century in certain quarters, and for this idea that we were basically all reading and watching the same thing. But it did come from an establishment that had a point of view. Yeah. And there were a lot of people I know in this country, having grown up in this country, who really didn't agree with that point of view, and it sort of fueled the rise of Fox News. It fueled the election of Ronald Reagan. I mean, in a way, it brought us to where we are, where there was this establishment, but people felt left out of it. And there is a possibility, this is the optimist in me coming out, but here we have this system now where if it's algorithms, we actually can look at algorithms and do things with them that might improve the situation once we know there's a problem. We have it now. There's algorithms. It's not just like family-owned newspapers and TV networks and so forth. Does that make sense?
Well, step one is always admitting you have a problem,
right.
I guess. We have a different set of problems, some overlapping, but a different set of problems than we did before. I think, of course, it's not just about algorithms. Newspapers have been crushed by social media, by Google in particular. Because and by Craigslist actually, that a lot of their existing revenue streams were just dried up and devastated. And even in the newspaper industry, what we're seeing is a concentration around a few big sources: New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and which were suffering, but now they've, especially ironically, because in the age of Trump,
they're doing great.
They're doing great.
Yeah.
But most other papers are doing worse and worse. And so that's, it's an interplay of human institutions, algorithms, human cognitive capacity. And so it's true. I mean, I don't know which of these things, where we can imagine for interventions to improve matters, right? We could say, well, other ways. Could billionaires, give, subsidized newspapers, right? Well, Bezos bought the Washington Post, right?
Yeah.
There are definitely, or you have, I mean, increasingly in some ways it goes back to, different eras and epochs of news media where you have powerful, wealthy people who have certain perspectives. Sheldon Adelson taking over the Las Vegas paper. I mean, there are a lot of we can think of a lot of examples. Fox News, obviously built a whole business model around a certain partisan filter on news, and that was pre-algorithm. There's I agree. Maybe some of the algorithmic elements are manipulable, and we've seen like, oh look, Google is serving up stuff on Holocaust denial. Well, Google said we're not going to do anything just for that search, but you know what? We're going to adjust the knobs a little bit, and oh voila, it's out of the top 10, right? It's number 11, so all's good.
But all's not good.
Yes, but it's really tricky stuff, right? So like let's we've done some research that looks at the dissemination of fake news on Twitter, and it shows how the bulk of it comes from a very small number of people. And I think we find roughly 80% of fake news as we would define it, which is like genuinely misinformation associated with, that looks like genuine news. The 80% comes from 0.1% of
users. Is it people, or is it a mix of people and bots?
People, because we were just looking at people.
Just people.
We developed a method that filters it just to a representative set of people. And so you could imagine interventions like, well, let's say those people can't tweet more. They're super sharing content, and most of it is fake news, but not all of it. But they're tweeting way more than you or I would. And so Twitter could say, you know what, let's just say that after your 10th tweet of the day, we're suppressing how much people algorithmically, silently, invisibly, turning the dial.
You down.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that would reduce the amount of fake news on Twitter dramatically. But on the other hand, how much do we want those kinds of interventions for Twitter to say, you know what, that's not for you, right? Or your voice, you've talked enough today. Versus thinking about that, maybe it should be up to the individuals following that individual who should make that decision. You're like, oh my gosh, this is like the 58th tweet about crazy stuff that I've seen this from this person today. I know how to turn the volume down.
Unfollow.
Right? I'll just unfollow or I'll mute if I want it to stay in polite company with this person. And so to what extent should it just be that the platforms making tools for curation by people easier? And then if you like that crazy stuff,
caveat emptor, basically.
That's right.
Yeah.
And and it would have been one day that the filters of truth would have been, and not only one day, but still many places around the world were not filtering what we might consider truth content, right? Galileo was being filtered. Right. And
that's the scary part.
Yes, that's the scary part.
And then arguably letting the people who are circulating crazy news have the right to do it is kind of the American way in many ways. I mean, it's up to us to decide what's true and what's false, but that has become such a heavy burden, right?
Yes.
And also the results we've learned can be massive.
That's right. Well, I mean, we still don't really know. That's a hypothesis what the results have been. Right. There's, it's not clear. Say that people are more ill-informed than they were, say, a generation ago. And it's not clear, for example, that misinformation materially affected the result in 2016, even though there was quite a bit of misinformation. It turns out that people may be, for better or for worse, largely impervious to information, misinformation or not. And that maybe is our saving grace, is that we have thick skulls.
Right. Our weakness is our strength.
Yes, that's right. And so I don't know. I mean, this is something we're working a lot on, and even after having worked really hard on it, I don't know what the right answer is. If I had a magic wand, if I was Mark Zuckerberg, what would I do? I mean, there are definitely some things I know I would have done differently, I hope. But in terms of the bigger picture, there are a lot of things here that pose real challenges. Now, there are other things that seem easier, like where there's like genuine threat to life and limb, which is what we can see. I mean, even there are difficult implementations for solutions, but if there are, if the platforms are being used to rally mobs to kill people, but even then, like, how do you detect that? How do you intervene?
Yeah, what do you do?
What do you do? It's hard.
You do have a new book out, David, that's about democracy. And why don't we actually sell a few copies here? Can you tell us the title of the book?
Happy to.
Yeah.
The title is Politics with the People, Building a Directly Representative Democracy. And it lays out the way that technology, in particular the internet, could be used to better connect citizens to the politicians who are supposed to be representing our preferences
Right.
and our views.
And you did some experiments where you showed that people sort of with a more direct dialogue with the politician could actually have a productive exchange.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. In a sense, we put a model of democracy into a test tube.
Right.
We got actual sitting members of Congress to have these online town halls with their constituents to talk about one of the hottest issues of the day, immigration, for most of the town halls. And this was, at a time when there was just a lot of red meat being thrown out there, a lot of inflammatory speech.
So this is under Trump, since
This
Trump
was
was
actually,
elected.
no, not since Trump. This was before Trump.
Oh,
But
okay. Okay.
this was actually, we originally started this in 2006.
Uh-oh.
But there was a lot of inflammatory stuff back then.
Yes,
This has
yeah.
this has been a hot issue.
Yeah.
I mean, look, this has sprung up as a hot issue many times over the last century.
Yeah.
And what emerged out of that were direct, frank, but civil conversations about the issues, where members of Congress were learning about what their constituents felt about the issue of immigration, but also they were getting informed about why the member had the position that they had. That there was a rationale, that you shouldn't just have a cynical view that this is malign politics.
Or lobbyists.
Or lobbyists or
something,
what have you, that there was a rationality here. And people could, to some extent, transcend, like if you're an interest group, right? If you're the AARP, right? You have to represent the interests of older Americans. You can't say, you know what, we see there are trade-offs here, and we view, maybe Social Security can't be quite as generous, but there'll be more childhood education.
Yeah, you have to take your position.
That's right. You have to take that's your job, right? But if you're an older American, you can discuss that and say, I care about the well-being of my grandchildren, and we need to think about how we pass on a society that is flourishing and is just. Right? That's not something that's not a kind of trade-off that interest groups can do. It is something that we can do as individuals that have interests, but our interests are complicated.
Right.
And we can have as individuals, we can be generous and empathic in a way that interest groups that may represent our interests cannot be. And so it offers, and it's not to say that there isn't a role for groups that represent our interests. There certainly is. But there's another pathway here which might allow us to to better trade off across interests, allow a conversation between that member of Congress who has to articulate a position and vote on a bill, to have that in conjunction with citizens. And this is very much the way our founding figures had. If you look at the Federalist Papers, right, they talk about how the role of especially the U.S. representative is to know the will of the people, right?
Yeah.
They were supposed to be the people, the politicians most enmeshed amongst the people. That was in some sense it was in some sense, in the view of the founders, a double-edged sword, and that's one of the reasons why they had senators who they thought would not be elected but would be appointed by state governments. That obviously has changed
that,
a long time ago. But the idea was that there would be some amount of direct contact and insulation.
And then some distance.
And some distance. Yeah. But when you go to, look, if you look at the vote totals of the first elections, right, there were members of Congress who were elected with fewer than 1,000 votes, right?
Wow.
We have, you have to have somewhere, we have constituencies where you're representing 700 or 800,000 people, right? And so if you're representing thousands, and note, by the way, part of the reason why was the constituencies were smaller, but this was also, politics was largely the domain of, white rich men, right? So I'm not looking fondly back at that time, and that goes back to the 20th century had its problems, the 19th century had its problems, and boy, the 21st century has its problems too, but we got to put it in perspective.
Right.
But just looking at the issue of scale, if you have a few thousand people that you need to represent, you can sort of mingle and get a sense of the perspectives. If you have hundreds of thousands, that's not a practical solution anymore. And indeed, what we know about how members of Congress connect with their constituents is that they end up looking at just a very narrow slice. They have their immediate contacts, they have their people who are in their party, their elites, and then much of their constituencies are often neglected. And indeed, there was a recent paper out showing what a distorted picture members of Congress have of the perspectives and viewpoints of their constituents. And so the hope, or our hope in starting these experiments, was to see if we could develop a model for a different way of doing things.
Yeah, it was exciting to read, and I read your account of it in a Washington Post piece, I think, that you did, and I had two reactions to it. One was sort of maybe the obvious reaction, but it reminded me of, the Habermas, Enlightenment coffee houses, and wait a minute, could we actually use technology to have a reboot of that? That would be amazing. But I also had a personal sort of connection to it, which is, that thing that's happened with doctors where you have your family doctor, but it's actually really impossible to have any contact with them because they're so busy and you can never get through to them even when you're sick. So I've been dealing with that for years, like everybody. And then I had a thing that was a little more serious where I had to go to Mass General, to a specialist. And Mass General has this portal, this online portal that you...
Patient gateway.
Yeah, that you put yourself into. And suddenly, you're talking to the doctor all the time. Doctor's so much more important doctor than the family doctor, but somehow technology has made him accessible to me. And we're having these rational back and forths about my condition. And it's similar, it's sort of like these people were talking to their members of Congress, right?
Well, that's right, and they're reaching into new contexts. And that's the other thing when we think about hopefully I think where medicine will go is that in some sense they're reaching into your family room. You're on your laptop, you're connecting with them. Makes it easier, but also even with modern medicine, you can imagine collecting data in context like at home or at work about your well-being that would not have been conceivable for the family doctor years ago, right? And that may be very consequential. And so similarly with these online experiments, these are people who were at home. They may have had children in the background, or these were younger people and that were, tilted a bit younger, and younger people are less engaged in politics. So this is a particularly exciting element. but this was a route that was quite familiar and comfortable
For them.
for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was like going to where they are.
Mm-hmm.
And it was doing it in a way that was very cost effective for the member, right? Because the member could just be, at home in their bathrobe, and they're, talking into a thing about, oh yeah, here's how I think about immigration. And
Yeah, they didn't
blah,
have to
blah,
get
blah.
dressed up and go
That's
to
right.
some literal town hall meeting and
That's right.
Yeah, physically. Yeah.
There's a lot of overhead to town halls,
Yeah.
and they tend to access the wings, the extremes of the political process.
Yeah.
And that, which is fine to a point, but then the question is, how do you get a sense of where most people are in the political system? And so we said, invite diverse people, and make it a convenient time, and basically go to their homes.
Yeah.
And voila,
Amazing.
got the people that we got were more representative of eligible voters than voters are, right? Because
Amazing.
voters tilt toward certain types of demographics.
Certain demographics.
That's
yeah,
right.
That's amazing.
That was like one of the key ingredients, I think, was just the invitation, just being asked.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the dysfunctions of our political system is that not enough people are being invited into the conversation. And I think the result for our political system has been quite dysfunctional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fascinating. You mentioned Herbert Simon earlier, pioneering artificial intelligence person from the 50s, really way back. I'm fascinated by him because he, as you know, was one of the first people to predict artificial general intelligence, which is sort of the ultimate expression of AI, coming soon.
Yeah.
He was way too early in his prediction.
Yes.
He saw it coming in the mid-1960s, I believe. But it is such an interesting question, and I want to ask you, just for our audience who are watching this, if you could define for us in a simple way artificial general intelligence, sort of what does that phrase mean? And then I want to hear about sort of where that might appear first.
Interesting question. I think I think our notions of AI have evolved quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
I think Herb Simon certainly had a view of, we can that humans are a kind of computer, and that we can create something of general capacity. My sense is, and having been into AI and cognitive science in the 80s, I think that ambition was still very much alive then. My sense, though, is that much of that vision has fallen by the wayside. That we're building much more specialized machines based more on statistical modeling, machine learning, et cetera, that are quite powerful and quite specialized. And so it would be difficult for me to hazard a guess in terms of when an artificial general intelligence might emerge. To me, it actually feels like the horizon has been constantly receding over the years. That as the more progress we make, the more we realize how difficult it is.
How far we have to go.
And yet at the same time, we have, for particular tasks, we have continually pushed the boundary of what we think computers can do versus humans. So, look, chess. There's a certain distinctive thing there, and it's really hard to make computers do that. Well, that was conquered some time ago, right? Well, Go relies in very distinctive ways on.
It has some intuition.
That's right. Yeah. Pattern recognition that's very distinctive to humans. Actually, that's been conquered, right? Way faster. I remember people saying, "Oh yeah, I'll never be conquered," and it seemed like 2 months later, it was done, right? And yet, of course, those are extremely limited domains. So it's both an astonishing accomplishment, but also a very limited accomplishment.
Right.
And so it's even like, driving a car, right? And we'll see when something that can truly be put on the streets of New York will work. But even that is a much more limited domain than what I had to deal with just going from bed to breakfast this morning. So I think we will see this. We can think of the mission of AI as it used to be seen as sort of this broad strategic battle on like how do we emulate general human intelligence, to now being like many tiny battles where there's been a lot of progress, and there's an interesting question of maybe in some sense that's how human intelligence works, that we have a lot of specialized cognitive systems, and that emerged over hundreds of millions of years, and that we're just a little impatient, right? I mean, Newell and Simon was, from 1950s, and maybe if we go from that to, oh my gosh, we've now conquered so many of the narrow problems that there isn't too much left. And maybe that'll take 150 years, and then we'll get to the year 2100, and we can, build robots that walk around and can do everything we can do, but better.
Right.
It's a great question.
There's a sort of a confusing dichotomy between the conversation now, I feel, sort of the popular conversation where on the one hand you have people like making fun of Siri because it's so bad, and like people recognizing there's all these limitations to artificial intelligence. And then you have these narratives coming from these sort of futuristic thinkers, including Elon Musk and others, that like this monster is about to appear that is smarter than all of us and just take over, and there's like kind of no middle place to live and sort of know what to expect really as a person. I think that the latter, the Elon Musk scary vision, seems to be a product of the old artificial general intelligence expectation.
Yes.
In new form, like in a darker form. And you're saying, I mean, it sounds good to me, that maybe we don't have to worry so much about that, but we do have to worry about taking these specialized versions to a good place.
I think that certainly, I suspect that's our problem for my lifetime. I think they could certainly take us to a very bad place.
Right.
And in some sense, we can think of these systems almost as having agency, right? Because they have evolved on a certain kind of selection mechanism. And so it's not the Elon Musk, or it's not Monster, or it's not Arnold Schwarzenegger. But it's this monster that's driven to figure out
one thing,
our every desire.
The paperclip.
The paperclip. Well, the paperclip that was that was not that engaging, but as Facebook is. And so the question, of course, the irony is that fads come and fads go, and so does younger people, interestingly, with all this refined machinery, with Facebook as being a vastly superior product in some sense than a decade ago. So having built that, having all the network effects, having all that data, figuring out what people want, so they've really refined this, and the machine learning algorithm is like figuring out how do we suck your eyeballs out. Younger people are like, yeah. I'm going to do something else. Right. And so it's really, nothing is inevitable, and there is a sort of attention-grabbing creature that Facebook is, that is seemingly highly evolved, that knows everything about us, knows everything about our friends, and so on, and still has a couple billion people using it. So I'm not writing them out of the equation at all. But to newer generations, they may not be that compelling.
This, and even Facebook is embracing that with these ads that the best part of life is off Facebook.
Yes.
It's a sort of an amazing turn.
Yes.
In the culture.
Yes, and I think it is. But how much my kids will be using Facebook, 10 years from now, it's an open question. I'm sure that's one that keeps some Facebook executives up at night.
Yes.
Although they're also doing things like trying to figure out what the next big thing is. So, that's why they own Facebook. There's Facebook, the service, but then there's Facebook, the company, which also owns Instagram
All
and
these other
WhatsApp
things,
and so on. And so part of their job is to see the future and buy it, and then port people over from their current platforms. Yeah. We know the future will be different than the present. At the moment, I'm not too worried about that global monster, but I am worried about socio-technical systems that optimize really, really well on things that are not really the social good, and that in the process do a lot of damage.
Right, and my sense is that if I could sum up what I feel has been your take, is that you're worried about those things, you have very clear-eyed about the threat, but you also feel there's a lot of room for avoiding a negative future and even for optimism.
Yes, I prefer to be optimistic. Some days it's easier than others, but it is. We truly live in days of wonder. I mean, the fact that, the things that we take for granted, that I could say, that I could talk into my phone and say, where's the nearest pizza place, and it will talk back to me. That I could think of fairly esoteric facts or questions I have, and I could just talk into my phone and it will tell me. Or, give you an utterly trivial example, but I'm the gadget guy in our household, and so my wife was like, I can't figure out how to change the time on my watch, my exercise watch. Can you fix it? I was like, yeah, not sure. And 2 hours later, after I've pressed every button 25 times, no progress. And then I get online, and it turns out that some woman at some time had said, my husband asked me to do this, and I spent hours on this, and I know someone else is going to have this problem.
And here's the answer.
I
love that. I know.
And it was just buried on this discussion forum.
And
somewhere.
We have those moments all the time now where someone's helping us, and they didn't even know they would help us specifically.
That's right. And I wish I could have. It would have been creepy if I had sent her a thank you note or something. But I had such gratitude because I was about to throw that watch away.
That's
and
great.
So the fact that, that's obviously a trivial little example, but it's emblematic of the ways that we can find answers to things that we couldn't find answers to before. We can connect, like I said, that lunch I had with my friend in Chicago, I wouldn't have had that lunch. If I have stuff in my garage I want to get rid of, it's way easier than ever before. If I have a little gadget that is broken in my dishwasher, it's so much easier to get that now than it would have been just a few years ago.
Oh, yeah.
If I am trying to do research on some medical thing, right? I don't have to, I'm a reasonably sophisticated consumer of information. I can read a lot of these medical studies and interpret the statistics and so on, and figure out, oh, that's good, that's bad. Well, it's so much easier to access that now, and I can, someone I knew had pancreatitis after running a marathon. Turns out that that's a thing that sometimes rarely happens, but not never, after a marathon. It's I could dig up the literature on that. That's amazing, right?
Yeah, there's so many amazing things. It's true.
And because this is the kind of person I am, I can go to Google and say, where was I on July 23rd, 2015? And it will tell me. And so I have this capacity of reconstructing my past in a way that is quite wonderful at times. And so there is all this extraordinary, wonderful stuff.
I notice all the positive examples you gave are not about our political lives.
Certainly, I think we're still working. There's sort of been this interesting cycle of thoughts about the role that that the internet, in particular, can play with politics. And it started out pretty utopian in the 1990s. Anybody can talk, right? And then it sort of shifted to more like anybody can talk, right? And so I think. Even with politics, we can point to many wonderful things of ways that people have learned about politics, gotten engaged in politics. I think that we can think of ways that social media have opened up alternative voices. Mm-hmm. And so, like, if we're thinking about the 20th century, there was this very small C conservative oligopoly on what we knew about the world, right? And I really don't, we have to be important not to glorify that. I know. It was terrible in many, many ways. And so, we have actually seen some really good things in terms of opening up to alternative voices. People on the margins have had their enhanced capacity to get their narrative out there and to each other. I think that, like, let's say, and this is an example that applies to health, but also to politics. If you have like some rare disease, right, that thousands of people have, that would have been very hard to connect with those other people, right? That's way easier today, right? To find out lessons from other people, what medicines work, what kinds of support systems. All of that is vastly more accessible, right? And the same thing goes with politics, of ways that we can connect. But it's also enabled many dark forces in society
to connect to each other.
To connect with each other, right? And so a lot of those peripheral groups may not be, they're no longer being subject to the control of that hegemonic conservative culture, right? And so, like, that's, again, it's a double-edged sword. And so, look, my grandparents were children in Eastern Europe, right? My grandmother left. They started walking away from their home, the home that she grew up in until she was, I think, 9 years old. This was during World War I, because the Cossacks were coming, right? And this was not a good thing as a Jew if the Cossacks were coming. Well, now we have pogroms and so on that are being enabled by social media, by Facebook, by WhatsApp, and so on. And so these aren't new things, but some of them would not have happened, I think, without the social media enablers. And so those are really dark forces. There are still Cossacks out there, and some of them are on Facebook.